Hollywood's golden age loved to market itself as a glittering escape, but behind those studio gates, Paranoia ran the show. Forget the scandals and the secret affairs. The real career killers were politicians in suits, ready to torch a star's life with a whisper or a subpoena. Here's a question for you. If you were a rising star, how far would you go to keep your name off a blacklist? Buckle in. Some of the industry's biggest icons never saw the political hit coming. Dalton Trumbo. There's Bold. And then there's Dalton Trumbo, one of Hollywood's highest paid, most sought-after screenwriters, until the government knocked on his door. Imagine writing blockbusters one year and scrubbing toilets under a fake name the next. That's not a metaphor. It's Trumbo's biography. In 1947, Congress called him to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee, demanding he rat out alleged communists in Hollywood. Trumbo refused. He didn't grovel. He didn't squirm. He just sat there, cool as a martini, and told them it was none of their business. That single act of defiance torched his career overnight. Blacklisted, branded, and officially untouchable, Trumbo went from Hollywood royalty to persona non grata. Studios erased his name from credits, friends vanished, and suddenly, a man who'd once shaped the industry was hustling scripts through backdoors and aliases just to pay rent. Ever heard of the Oscar-winning Roman Holiday or The Brave One? Both penned by Trumbo, but he just couldn't sign his name. But here's the twist. Trumbo didn't just survive. He outfoxed the system. He wrote in secret, using fronts, and watched as his scripts picked up Oscars anyway. Years later, when the blacklist era collapsed under its own hypocrisy, Trumbo got his credit back and his vindication. The studios apologized, the Academy restored his name, and Hollywood pretended they never stabbed him in the back. Trumbo's story isn't just about politics. It's a gritty lesson in refusing to kneel, even when the whole town is waiting for your apology. Edward G. Robinson. Edward G. Robinson was the tough-talking gangster of the silver screen, a guy whose voice could scare the truth out of anyone, except, apparently, Washington politicians. Robinson had it all: box office hits, critical acclaim, and that signature sneer that made audiences love to hate him. But when the Red Scare rolled through Hollywood, it didn't care if you were playing criminals or catching them. Just being suspect was enough. Robinson wasn't a card-carrying communist. What he was, though, was an outspoken supporter of liberal causes and an easy target for rumor. As anti-communist hysteria took over the headlines, his name crept onto gray lists. No courtroom drama, no grand accusations. Just a cold, creeping freeze from the studios. Offers dried up. Producers who once begged for his schedule suddenly forgot his number. And Robinson, a man used to running the show, found himself having to explain, over and over, that he'd never been a party member, just a patriot with opinions. Here's the gut punch. Robinson cooperated. He went to HUAC. He named organizations he'd donated to, bent over backwards to prove his loyalty, and still found himself banished from top billing. The man who'd terrified movie villains was undone by fear-mongering and backroom politics. Eventually, he clawed his way back, no thanks to Hollywood's power brokers, but the damage was done. His leading man days were history. In the end, Robinson's biggest crime wasn't treason. It was believing that talent could ever be enough to protect you from a political witch hunt. Lena Horne. Lena Horne wasn't just a star. She was a revolution in a dress. When MGM signed her in the 1940s, she was one of the first black actresses to break into Hollywood's big leagues, dazzling audiences with that velvet voice and a presence you couldn't dim even if you tried. But Lena wasn't interested in playing the Hollywood game by the old rules. She spoke out loudly against racial injustice, refused degrading roles, and aligned herself with the civil rights movement. In an era when studios wanted to sweep social issues under the red carpet, Lena brought them front and center. But in post-war America, activism came with a price tag, especially if you had the nerve to be black, female, and unafraid. When the Red Scare hit, Lena's outspokenness was twisted into un-American activities. The FBI built a file on her the size of a studio script, tracking her associations, speeches, and every headline she made. She wasn't a communist, but that hardly mattered. Just being seen at the wrong rally or signing the wrong petition was enough to get you flagged. And Hollywood? They folded like a cheap deck. Studios quietly phased her out of leading roles. TV executives stopped calling. Her contracts evaporated, and overnight, Lena went from headliner to liability. For years, she had to hustle for gigs outside the mainstream. Nightclubs, concert halls, anywhere they'd let her sing without asking her to apologize for being herself. She survived, sure. She reinvented. But Hollywood lost its guts, and one of its brightest icons, in the process. Lena Horne's story is a blueprint for every star who ever tried to change the rules and paid the price. She didn't just get caught in the crossfire. She stood her ground and made it harder for Hollywood to hide its prejudices ever again. John Garfield. If there was ever a poster child for talented but doomed, it was John Garfield. He wasn't born with a silver spoon. He grew up on the streets of New York, learned to fight for every break, and by the 1940s, he'd become Hollywood's new kind of anti-hero. Tough, soulful, and as real as the city that raised him. But for all his on-screen grit, Garfield didn't stand a chance against the machine of Cold War paranoia. Here's how it went down. Garfield, like a lot of his generation, leaned left. He believed in social justice, supported unions, and wasn't shy about saying so. But as Washington's spotlight turned to Hollywood, even a hint of progressive leanings could turn into a political death sentence. Suddenly, Garfield was subpoenaed by HUAC, grilled about his associations, and asked to name names. He refused. No apologies, no betrayals. Just a flat, know the price? His name landed on the blacklist. Studios turned their backs overnight. Friends distanced themselves. Once the darling of Warner Brothers, Garfield found himself hustling stage work and indie projects just to keep the lights on. The stress was relentless, a perfect storm of legal battles, bad press, and the constant threat of ruin. At 39, Garfield's heart gave out. Some say the political pressure didn't just end his career, it ended his life. In the end, John Garfield's greatest role wasn't on screen. It was in standing up to a system that demanded obedience over integrity. Hollywood lost a legend, and the world lost an actor who might have changed the game, if only the game hadn't been rigged from the start. Zero Mostel. Zero Mostel didn't just steal scenes, he detonated them. Wild, irreverent, larger than life, Mostel was the kind of performer who could make you forget your troubles for a minute, then hit you with a punchline that left a scar. But behind the laughs was a target. As the Red Scare swept through Hollywood, Mostel's comedy, leftist leanings, and refusal to play it safe put him directly in the crosshairs. In the late 1940s, Mostel was hitting his stride, nabbing juicy film roles, and becoming a stage sensation. But when HUAC started its hunt for un-American activities, he refused to bend. He didn't snitch, didn't play coy. He turned the hearings into performance art, mocking the investigators, answering questions with riddles, and basically treating the whole spectacle as a bad joke. The committee was not amused. Hollywood, unfortunately, was even less amused. Within months, Mostel's movie career was vaporized. Studios blacklisted him, clubs stopped booking him, and his name became radioactive. He hustled odd jobs and played tiny gigs to pay the bills, never certain if he'd ever work again. The psychological toll was brutal. Mostel suffered a car accident, bouts of depression, and years in the professional wilderness. But you couldn't keep Zero down for long. He made a miraculous comeback on Broadway with A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum and Fiddler on the Roof, turning his blacklist scars into a badge of honor. Mostel didn't just outlast his enemies, he ridiculed them out of relevance. His career is living proof that sometimes The best revenge is surviving long enough to laugh at the people who tried to destroy you. Gale Sondergaard. Gale Sondergaard knew what it meant to go from the heights of Hollywood to the cold edge of oblivion, all because she refused to betray her principles. Picture this. She won the very first Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress, dazzling audiences with her sophisticated, steely performances. For a decade, Sondergaard was the woman behind the curtain. Never quite the lead, but always the power you couldn't ignore. But when the political inquisition hit Hollywood, her loyalty to her husband, screenwriter Herbert Biberman, one of the infamous Hollywood 10, put a bullseye on her back. Here's where it gets ugly. Sondergaard could have cut ties, played innocent, and kept her career afloat. Instead, she refused to denounce Biberman or his political beliefs. Hollywood doesn't reward that kind of devotion, especially when the heat is on. Practically overnight, her phone stopped ringing. Offers vanished. The woman who had once worked alongside Bette Davis and Basil Rathbone suddenly couldn't get a B-movie callback. Studios quietly scrubbed her from casting lists, and friends disappeared faster than a tabloid story on Monday morning. With no roles, Sondergaard's career flatlined. She left Hollywood behind, scraping by on stage gigs and obscure TV appearances, anything to stay connected to her craft. For years, her only crime was standing by the man she loved and refusing to play the studio's dirty game. It would take decades for Hollywood to admit its mistake, by which time Sondergaard's stardom was a ghost of its former glory. Her story is the classic Hollywood morality play, where loyalty becomes a liability, and silence is never as dangerous as speaking the truth. Herbert Biberman. If you ever want to see how quickly a director can go from celebrated artist to industry outcast, look no further than Herbert Biberman. He wasn't just a filmmaker. He was a fighter, one of the original Hollywood 10 who refused to testify before HUAC and paid for it with a jail sentence and a career in ruins. At the time, Biberman was known for his left-wing activism and his ability to bring raw, real stories to the screen. When the subpoenas arrived, he didn't flinch. He stood his ground, declared his rights, and refused to sell out his friends or his principles. Hollywood responded with surgical brutality. Biberman was fired from every studio job overnight. His name was splattered across headlines as a communist sympathizer, making him untouchable not just in LA, but in the entire entertainment business. The industry that once courted his vision now treated him like a contagion. The irony? Biberman's biggest crime was believing in social justice and freedom of expression, the very things Hollywood liked to preach about at award shows. Blacklisted, broke, and watched by the FBI, Biberman refused to fade quietly. He banded together with other outcasts to make Salt of the Earth, a daring, union-themed film shot on a shoestring budget with a mostly non-professional cast. Studios refused to distribute it. Theaters boycotted it. Even the government tried to shut it down. But the movie survived, becoming a cult classic and a defiant middle finger to Hollywood's cowardice. Biberman's story is a lesson in artistic rebellion. Sometimes the movies that matter most are the ones nobody wants you to see. Howard Da Silva. Howard Da Silva was the kind of actor who brought gravitas to every role, on Broadway, in Hollywood, and, unfortunately, on the wrong end of a political witch hunt. With a rugged face and a voice like gravel, he could play villains, heroes, or anything in between. But in the late 1940s, just as his star was rising, Da Silva got caught in the crossfire of the blacklist. His crime? Attending a few meetings, supporting progressive causes, and, worst of all, refusing to grovel when Congress came calling. When HUAC summoned Da Silva, he didn't give them what they wanted. He invoked the Fifth Amendment, perfectly legal but fatal for a showbiz career. The studios didn't need proof. Suspicion was enough. Overnight, Da Silva's film and radio offers dried up. He was even replaced in the finished film Knock on Any Door, despite having already shot his scenes. It didn't matter that he'd never been a party leader or a rabble-rouser. Just being on the wrong list meant you were out. Da Silva's exile lasted nearly a decade. He survived by returning to the stage, teaching, and accepting bit parts under pseudonyms. But the real cost was in the years stolen from a promising career, the roles that never happened, and the sense that no matter how talented you were, politics could always rewrite the script. Da Silva eventually clawed his way back into the business, most memorably as Benjamin Franklin in the musical 1776. But he never forgot how quickly Hollywood could slam the door. His story is a warning. In showbiz, talent may open doors, but politics can slam them shut just as fast. Larry Parks. Larry Parks was living the Hollywood dream, until one congressional hearing turned it into a living nightmare. In the 1940s, he was the golden boy at Columbia Pictures, dazzling audiences as Al Jolson in The Jolson Story, which earned him an Oscar nomination and the kind of fame most actors only imagine. But behind the scenes, the walls were closing in. When the House Un-American Activities Committee called Parks to testify in 1951, he faced a career-defining dilemma: name names or risk it all. The pressure was immense. Parks tried to resist, begging the committee not to force him into betraying friends and colleagues. He broke down in tears on the stand, pleading for his dignity, an extraordinary moment of raw humanity on national television. But in the end, the machine got what it wanted. He confessed his former Communist Party membership and, under duress, provided names. It wasn't enough to save him. Hollywood, ever the fair-weather friend, promptly blacklisted him. Columbia Pictures, which had once treated Parks as a cash cow, abruptly ended his contract. Roles vanished overnight. Even audiences turned away, unsure whether to see a traitor or a victim in his eyes. Parks spent years hustling in dinner theaters and low-budget productions, his film stardom reduced to a painful memory. The cruel irony: the industry that forced him to betray himself never let him back in the club. Larry Parks's story is a case study in Hollywood's most ruthless paradox. No matter how many rules you follow, the house always wins. Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson was the kind of star who didn't just light up a screen. He lit a fire under the entire system. With a voice that could shake the rafters and a presence that commanded respect, Robeson was a singer, actor, athlete, and activist. He was also, as far as the FBI was concerned, public enemy number one. Robeson's politics were bold and unapologetic. He spoke out against racism, colonialism, and class oppression, not just in America, but all over the world. He refused to stay in his lane, and for a while, his talent made him untouchable. But as Cold War paranoia gripped America, Robeson's outspokenness became a target. Government agencies kept him under constant surveillance. Concert halls closed their doors. Hollywood and Broadway blacklisted him. Then, the U.S. State Department dropped the hammer. They revoked his passport, effectively exiling him within his own country. Imagine being a global superstar, then suddenly not even allowed to leave the country for a concert. The effect was devastating. Robeson couldn't work, couldn't travel, and was hounded by smear campaigns. The stress took a toll on his health and reputation. Yet, he never apologized for demanding justice. Eventually, he regained his passport and a measure of his freedom. But Hollywood never really welcomed him back. Robeson's legacy isn't just as an artist. They tried to silence him, but he became a symbol of what happens when power is threatened by principle. In a town that loves applause, Robeson showed the courage to stand up even when the audience turned hostile. Ring Lardner Jr. You want a story of Hollywood hubris meeting the buzzsaw of American politics? Enter Ring Lardner Jr., the screenwriter who could outwit producers but never outmaneuver the blacklist. Lardner was born into literary royalty. with a famous father and a knack for turning social commentary into sharp, witty scripts. By the 1940s, he'd already nabbed an Oscar for Woman of the Year and was on a fast track to the top of the studio system. But talent wasn't enough when the political tide shifted. In 1947, Lardner became one of the Hollywood 10, the group of writers and directors who refused to testify before HUAC. He didn't mince words or try to worm his way out. He took the fifth, stood by his colleagues, and went to prison for contempt of Congress. Overnight, Lardner's name was radioactive. Studios scrubbed him from projects, contracts disappeared, and his old friends vanished into the shadows. For years, he survived by writing under fake names, watching others win awards for scripts he had actually penned. Lardner eventually clawed his way back, winning a second Oscar for MASH in 1970, but the scars of exile never fully healed. He remained an outspoken critic of the industry's moral cowardice, reminding everyone that Hollywood's glamour could turn toxic at the drop of a subpoena. Lardner's legacy is proof that the pen may be mightier than the sword, but it's no match for a government blacklist with an axe to grind. Jean Muir. Jean Muir was a rising MGM star, a fresh face with Broadway chops and a sparkling future. But in 1950, her career was crushed by a pamphlet. Yes, a pamphlet. Red Channels was the infamous anti-communist blacklist that named names and left Hollywood running scared. Muir hadn't been a political firebrand. Her crimes were signing a couple of petitions and attending some meetings in support of civil rights and free speech. That's all it took. The damage was instant and savage. Muir was set to star in the live NBC sitcom, The Aldrich Family. She showed up for rehearsals one week, and by the next, her name had been yanked from the cast. NBC caved to pressure from nervous sponsors, and viewers convinced she was a communist. No hearing, no trial, not even a phone call. She simply vanished from Hollywood overnight, branded with a political scarlet letter. Muir never really recovered. Hollywood, always looking for an excuse to discard women when they aged out of ingenue, found the blacklist a perfect reason. She pivoted to regional theater and teaching drama, but her days as a screen star were gone for good. Jean Muir's story isn't just a cautionary tale. It's a glimpse at how fast the industry could turn on you, and how even the smallest whiff of controversy could erase years of hard work. In a town obsessed with image, Muir became a ghost for simply believing she had the right to think for herself. Burgess Meredith. Long before he became everyone's favorite grizzled trainer in Rocky, Burgess Meredith was an acclaimed stage and screen actor, one of the brightest talents of his generation. But in the late 1940s, as the Red Scare took hold, Meredith's outspoken leftist views made him a marked man. He wasn't a secret communist. He was just vocal about workers' rights, civil liberties, and freedom of speech. In McCarthy-era Hollywood, that was more than enough to put a target on your back. Meredith's name appeared in red channels, and the damage was immediate. Studio doors slammed shut. He was dropped from big projects, replaced in cast lists, and left scrambling for stage roles while his film career went dark. It wasn't just a professional hit. It was personal. Meredith's friends distanced themselves, fearful that association could ruin their own careers. The actor's finances took a nosedive, and he was forced into near exile from the screen for nearly a decade. But Meredith didn't just fade away. He doubled down on theater, rebuilding his reputation one performance at a time. Decades later, he roared back as Mickey in Rocky, a role that reminded the world why they'd fallen in love with him in the first place. His story is proof that Hollywood can try to bury talent, but real grit is hard to keep down. The blacklist tried to erase Burgess Meredith, but he outlasted it, and in the end, stole the show. Lionel Stander. Lionel Stander had a face made for character parts and a mouth made for trouble, at least as far as HUAC was concerned. With his gravelly voice and fearless attitude, Stander was a scene stealer in everything from screwball comedies to noir classics. But in the 1940s, his activism and willingness to call out injustice put him directly in the crosshairs of Hollywood's political purge. Unlike some, Stander didn't play the shrinking violet. When summoned to testify before Congress, he turned the tables, delivering biting, sarcastic answers that skewered the committee's logic. "My only subversive act," he famously quipped, "was acting in lousy pictures." But wit wasn't enough to save him. Studios, terrified of bad press, slammed their doors. Stander was blacklisted by the major guilds, left hustling for bit parts in low-budget films, and taking gigs in Europe just to keep working. Years of exile and financial hardship followed. But Stander never apologized, never backtracked. He kept fighting for union rights, civil liberties, and the freedom to speak his mind. Eventually, he was welcomed back to Hollywood, most famously as Max in the TV series Heart to Heart. Stander's story is pure Hollywood irony. The guy who refused to play along with the system ended up beloved by a new generation, proving that some careers are just too tough to kill. Will Geer. Will Geer is best remembered by most as the wise and gentle Grandpa Walton, but in real life, he had a spine of steel. Geer's roots were deep in folk music, activism, and radical politics. He marched with striking workers, sang protest songs with Woody Guthrie, and stood tall for civil rights before it was fashionable or safe. But in the paranoid fever of post-war Hollywood, those credentials read like a confession. Geer was hauled before HUAC in 1951, and unlike so many, he didn't dance around the questions or name names. He openly admitted his leftist beliefs and refused to betray his friends. Hollywood's answer? Ban him. Geer's film and television career was dead in the water. Studios and producers shut their doors, and the industry pretended he didn't exist. For a decade, he scraped by, touring with traveling theater troupes, teaching, and starting the famed Theatricum Botanicum in Topanga Canyon, which became a haven for other blacklisted artists. He didn't make a triumphant Hollywood comeback until the 1970s, when he was cast as Grandpa Walton and found a whole new audience. His story is proof that integrity outlasts even the harshest blacklist. Will Geer wasn't just a casualty of political plots. He was a survivor who built something lasting from Hollywood's wreckage, teaching generations that principle is worth any price. Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin was more than a comedian. He was a global icon, a creative genius, and for a time, the most famous man in the world. But Chaplin also dared to think for himself, speak out against fascism, and challenge American politics from the left. In a climate of mounting suspicion and xenophobia, that made him an irresistible target. The FBI and J. Edgar Hoover kept thick files on Chaplin, cataloging every speech, donation, and off-color joke. Accused of un-American activities, targeted for his personal life, and lambasted for refusing to become a U.S. citizen, Chaplin was eventually branded a dangerous radical. In 1952, while traveling abroad for the premiere of Limelight, he got the ultimate Hollywood kiss-off. The U.S. government revoked his re-entry visa. The country he'd helped shape through art and laughter slammed the door shut. Chaplin spent the rest of his life in exile in Switzerland. His films were still admired, but the American industry that owed him so much never fully apologized. Chaplin's story is a jaw-dropping example of how quickly the Dream Factory could turn into a political firing squad. He wasn't toppled by a flop or a scandal, but by a government afraid of an artist who made people think. Orson Welles. Orson Welles was the wunderkind who rewrote the rules of cinema with Citizen Kane, and then spent the rest of his life paying for his genius and his politics. Welles was outspoken, opinionated, and allergic to towing the party line. He backed progressive causes, spoke up for the marginalized, and refused to keep his big ideas in a tidy box. That made him a marked man. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, Welles' FBI file grew thicker than most screenplays, He was surveilled, investigated, and targeted as a possible subversive. Studios grew wary of his reputation, not just for being difficult, but for his politics. Major projects slipped through his fingers. Financing dried up. Even when Welles fled to Europe, hoping to find creative freedom, Hollywood never fully forgave or forgot. Despite the setbacks, Welles never lost his defiant edge. He kept making movies on shoestring budgets, hustling for every dollar, and redefining what a director could do with nothing but willpower and nerve. Orson Welles' Hollywood downfall was no accident. It was a slow-motion political assassination. And even as he struggled, he inspired generations to keep fighting for art that doesn't flinch when power comes knocking. J. Edward Bromberg. J. Edward Bromberg was the classic character actor, dependable, versatile, and beloved by fellow performers. But when the blacklist fever swept through Hollywood, even quiet, hard-working talents weren't safe. Bromberg was an active member of the Actors Lab, a progressive theater group, and that was enough to get him noticed by HUAC. When he was called before the committee, Bromberg refused to name names or betray his friends. That act of principle marked him for career destruction. Suddenly, this once busy actor was unemployable. Studio contracts dried up. Television opportunities vanished. Even his theater work became scarce, as producers scrambled to avoid controversy. The stress was immense, and Bromberg's health took a steep dive. Isolated and under relentless political pressure, he suffered a fatal heart attack in 1951 while working in London, far from the Hollywood stages where he once thrived. Bromberg's story is a quiet tragedy, the kind Hollywood never put on screen. A decent man, broken by an indecent political moment, punished not for any crime, but for refusing to play along. Ossie Davis. Ossie Davis was a towering talent, a writer, actor, director, and activist who used every stage he could find to fight for justice. In the racially charged atmosphere of mid-century America, Davis's activism alone put him on government watch lists. Add in his friendships with known progressives and blacklisted artists, and Hollywood started to see him as too dangerous. FBI surveillance followed him everywhere, and studios, ever wary of bad press, were quick to distance themselves from any hint of controversy. Davis never hid who he was. He spoke out for civil rights, desegregation, and labor rights, turning down roles that insulted his dignity and standing shoulder to shoulder with blacklisted colleagues. While he never faced a formal Hollywood blacklist, the shadow followed him for decades. Work dried up, and many mainstream projects were closed off. But Davis persisted, breaking through on his own terms in theater, independent film, and, eventually, television. His career stands as proof that principle sometimes costs you everything, but the reward is a legacy no blacklist can erase. Sam Jaffe. Sam Jaffe had the face of a wise old professor and the soul of a rebel. Known for his roles in classics like The Day the Earth Stood Still and Ben-Hur, Jaffe's career spanned both the silent and sound eras. But when McCarthyism's icy grip tightened, Jaffe was swept up in the purge. His long history of union support and left-leaning activism was suddenly ammunition for his enemies. Like so many, Jaffe was named in red channels and blacklisted from major studio films. He moved to New York and Europe, finding work on the stage and in television. But the steady flow of Hollywood roles was gone. For years, Jaffe's brilliant career was reduced to scattered gigs and missed opportunities. Only after the blacklist's power faded did he return to mainstream movies, earning an Oscar nomination for The Asphalt Jungle. Jaffe's journey is the Hollywood blacklist in a nutshell. A career derailed not by talent or box office, but by suspicion and fear. So next time you're swept up in the glow of old Hollywood, remember, it wasn't just glitz and glamour. It was also a battlefield, where reputations lived or died on a whisper, and the wrong politics could end it all. Some stars broke, Some survived, and a few came back stronger, but none of them escaped untouched. Which of these stories surprised you most? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit subscribe for more untold Hollywood history, and keep questioning what's behind the curtain. This isn't just the movies, it's real life.